It's really fun watching the maturing of technology through the 1980s. So many things happened, so many standards were made, and there's still a lot of things that to this day only started off at some point within the 80s. I mean, let's take a look at storage technology. In 1980, most minis and micros were still using the 8-inch floppy disk format, but that would then transition to 5¼ inch, and then 3½ inch. And then by 1989, you had companies such as Canon releasing magneto-optical storage. This one here was actually used in the next Cube computer at the end of the decade. But just because magneto-optical is the most advanced storage method that you could get your hands on, doesn't necessarily mean it was going to be the successor and the future and the standard for everything to come after it. The life and death of Apricot computers could be summarized by looking at 3 specific years. They existed before them, and they existed after them. 1983, it was a year of growth. In 1984, it was a year of great changes. In 1985, it was a year of acceptance. Look at what we have here. The entire F series was not as commercially successful as they had wished of it. Look at the software selections they had. You had third parties who were supplying directly in box to them. They had first-party licensed software, and then they had software they had developed themselves in-house. There was a huge catalog. You had speech recognition. You had wireless peripherals. You had absolutely wild design languages that made your systems just weirdly shaped or weirdly narrow. Customers didn't care anymore. It was 1985. How many people were still messing around with non-IBM PC compatibles? It was an increasingly dwindling number, and everybody else in the UK computing industry knew this was happening now, and it wasn't something they had control over. IBM didn't even have control over it themselves. Once the clone market took off and cloned IBM BIOSes in clean room environments were available, you could get a minimum specification partial DIY IBM PC for as low as $600. It made an absolute fool of everybody else, and it was 100% IBM PC compatible. And that is why, in 1985, Apricot would once again try and say they know the market by introducing a new computer. This is the Apricot Zen. It was revolutionary in Apricot terms because this was their first computer to use Intel's then new 7.5 MHz 286 microprocessor. This system in its basic configuration had 512 kilobytes of RAM and could be upgraded to upwards of 1 megabyte of RAM. Storage consisted of 1 or 2 3.5-inch Sony micro floppy disk drives and 1 internal 20 megabyte hard drive. Monitor options included a beautiful, to-the-theme white phosphor CRT display, which I don't have, or this green phosphor CRT display, which I do have. Other options that you could get with it was, once again, you had yourself a trackball mouse, and you had yourself, once again, a regular wired keyboard with the micro screen display. And on the one side of the machine, you could also get yourself a telephone and a modem attachment, and a software package called Zentel, which turned this into a full-fledged office computer with telephony controls. Reviews on the Zen were mixed. Everyone was amazed. If you were a supporter of the Apricot architecture, which is its own non-PC compatible MS-DOS setup, you loved it. Like everything, like it went right back to its basics. It worked exactly as you expected. There was no compatibility issues like we had seen with the F series. And once again, it was brilliantly designed. Critics, on the other hand, were quick to point out, it's 1985, dude. What the hell are you doing releasing another non-PC compatible computer? What did Apricot do to that one there? They flinched. In the middle of manufacturing and sales of the Apricot Zen, a new model popped up. That one was called the Apricot Xen-I. But ultimately, that is the computer that you're seeing here in front of you right now. So what were the major changes that were applied to this machine? Well, the first one was that for the first time since the Victor 9000 of the Sirius 1, we had a 5¼ inch floppy drive once again. We were getting rid of the 2 Sony micro floppy drives that were on here because the PC industry, for a large part of the 80s so far, had not adopted 3.5-inch floppy disks as a standard. Ironically, it would come back to bite them by abandoning it because within a few years, companies such as IBM would be quick to adopt the brand new 720 kilobyte and later 1.44 megabyte 3.5-inch floppy disk standard. The 5.25-inch drive that's actually in here is a 1.2 megabyte double-sided high-density type. The idea here is that they were now looking for IBM PC AT compatibility. So there's your 286 and your 512K of RAM right there. What that also meant is that this is now a 100% IBM PC compatible. There is no longer the proprietary Apricot BIOS in here. It now uses a variant of the Phoenix BIOS. Yep, it's a PC clone now. This machine is bizarre. It's also completely shrouded in mystery. The first time I ever saw an Apricot computer, it was a Zen. It was 1994. My dad's engineering firm that he worked at was throwing these things away. I only remembered these because of the micro screen's buttons, and I didn't see any mention of these computers again until like 2003, 2004. And then I finally clued into what Apricot was, and that started us in this whole collecting of ACT Apricot computers. But it took me 26 damn years to finally be able to get my hands on another Zen. So now that I have one, there's some amazing things I want to talk about on this here because, I mean, there's the history that you can look up, but once you own them, you begin to realize there's a bunch of half-baked ideas that were in this computer when it shipped. And there's also an astounding amount of jank to which I can only attribute to Apricot was in a panic and they needed to get something out the door just to be able to sell in volume. Zens were probably not doing all that great. They needed a PC compatible. They were already 70% of the way there before they went to the full PC compatibility. Starting off with that, as I just slide the whole machine here out of the way, once again, we're going to come back to the trackball mouse. Now, we saw this previously when I did a video on the Apricot PC Xi. This is the same mouse. If I flip it over, however, you may notice that it has a door on the underside of it. And if you take that up and you open it, it's just an empty compartment, which kind of shows that a battery is supposed to sit inside of here. And there's also a knockout that's blocked here, and there's a hole right here. What we're looking at is one of Apricot's infrared mice that they've repurposed into a wired mouse. So instead of just redesigning something, they just reused the moldings that they had for their infrared mice, and to save money and to cut costs, bundled it with the Apricot Zen. The keyboard is, well, it's a keyboard if we're going to talk about that. I don't have the Zentel accessory, so I can't necessarily talk about that. If we look on the back here, there's our janky connector here where the mouse plugs in, and then we have a little 2.5 millimeter plug that's hanging out right there. So this is something here that kind of blew my mind. Like I'd remembered with the Apricot Portable, the 2.5 millimeter jack was for the microphone for the speech and voice recognition system. And it's interesting, if I can figure out where I put it, there it is. This over here, where normally you'd expect the escape key is hiding over here, by the way. That's actually a piece of plastic that you can remove. And I'm assuming, since this plastic casting fits the base of the microphone almost perfectly, there's actually a proper insert that went in there. That would go in there, and then you would plug the 2.5-inch cable there, and then you had a microphone on the front of the computer. Okay, so whatever, that doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot. Maybe it was for the Zentel system or something like that. That's entirely possible, except there's one more thing. There is an op-amp circuit in here for an analog to digital conversion and conditioning. Those lines go through the keyboard and go into the computer. On the front of the Zen, you have these LED indicators: the floppy disk drive, the hard disk drive, power, and voice. Where have we seen that before? On the Apricot Portable. They tried to include the voice recognition system inside of the Zen. However, late in the game, even before the original non-PC compatible Zen was available. They dropped it. They got 80% of the way there and then abandoned it completely. So we're going to find dead headers inside that go nowhere inside of it, but there is no Dragon speech technology or anything that's built into it that's blatantly obvious. There's also just weirdness that's associated with the case itself as I get around to it. So if I go around here, you can see I've lost one of the knockouts. There's a header right there. There's another knockout that goes in right there. And what's supposed to happen is that there's not enough space in here to put full-length ISA cards. Instead, there's a sidecar that you could get for the Zen that plugs into it, and then it gives you space for not only full-length ISA cards, I think it also gives you provisional space if you want to add back a 3.5-inch floppy drive for whatever reason. You can do so with this spot because also the floppy interface breaks out to these connectors as well. The fun thing is that when they went to IBM PC compatibility, it broke Apricot PC compatibility. So if you had software on 3.5-inch discs, your programs didn't run, but you could probably transfer all of your data over to the new applications because, again, DBase was available, Lotus was available, WordPerfect was available. You get the idea. Spinning around to the back of the system here is even more questions. First off, I have DC out. It's a Molex header. It's a standard PC Molex header like we have today on computers. So 2 grounds in the middle, 5 volts, 12 volts, and an extra screw here for ground. I'm not entirely sure why the heck you would do that because the expansion sidecar would supply its own power. We now have a standard 25-pin parallel port interface, a standard 9-pin serial interface, and a standard 9-pin TTL video interface for monochrome. If you want color, you have the Apricot monitor output that sits over here in a different gender. It's worth pointing out the addition of IBM PC compatibility dropped Apricot's own graphics system and went with Hercules compatibility. So now you have even higher resolution monochrome graphics available. There's also this piece of black plastic that's hiding right here. That's factory, I believe you. But if I pull that off, I get location here for a second power switch, and I can see into the circuit board to a 15-pin header that says power in. So on the original non-PC compatible version of the Zen, the power supply was an external black brick. And there was a lot of criticism as to why the hell that was a thing. Again, that falls into this like weird like Britishism jank, and I guess they were just desperate to do something. But later models of the Zen would go and actually replace this here with just networking provisions because these here were available in a number of different configurations. You could get them as a standalone workstation, you could get them as a diskless, net bootable workstation, and then you could get them with a variety of front external drives on them as well over the years. On the far end here, I have another connector, and that is for the keyboard. Let me see if I can carefully pop that back on there. There we go. And you may notice I have this marked as 120 volts. This system, as you see with the monitor, keyboard, and all of that there, I purchased this from an individual in the United Kingdom and paid, oh my God, probably $300 to get this thing boxed up and shipped over here. I've actually done a video on this once before, so I've restored the hard disk on this. We're going to get into that later, but I just want to continue talking about the jank and do the teardown like we've done with our last couple of videos. Turning it around the one last way, even though we have a keyboard header on the back of the unit, you can clearly see there's a knockout here where the other keyboard on the previous iteration of the Zen used to go, and the black button there is the reset button. Okay, now let's go grab our screwdrivers and open it up. Now, as I take this one apart here, I was at least warned beforehand about what was inside. Oldcomputers.com has a section devoted to Apricot, and with the Zen they have an internal photograph showing that it contains a 20 megabyte RODIMM hard drive. Now, RODIMM hard drives are kind of the scorn of folks who have Apple HD20 hard drives because these are not necessarily known for their reliability. Okay, that's fine. The Apricot PC Xi I own has a 10 megabyte RODIMM drive in it right now. So of course, I was absolutely horrified when I went to open my machine up and discovered it didn't have a RODIMM drive in it. It had a 20 megabyte mini scribe. Seriously, those are terrible drives. Mini scribe 3.5-inch drives are not well known for their reliability. Amstrad used them. There was the whole Anyways, I wasn't necessarily happy because I know these drives have a high failure rate, and surprise, surprise, the drive in this machine when I got it was stone dead. I had to dig through my inventory of spare hard drives because it's a twin cable MFM drive, and I was able to find one more hard drive that was compatible with the BIOS and hard disk controller that's inside of the Zen. It's another 20 megabyte mini scribe hard drive. This one is really stupid. If it's cold, it doesn't boot correctly. There's a ton of bad sectors on it. Yes, I follow the instructions regarding heating the drive up to operating temperature when you do a low-level format. They're just terrible drives. I really don't like them. Anyways, let's continue on with the teardown here. The other thing that I was afraid of when I got the machine is battery damage. I had seen in the non-PC versions that the battery hangs out over here. There has been a board revision done. The battery no longer lives there. There is now a battery that's hiding underneath the power supply. So let's start over here by taking the cover off of the drive bays. And by the way, while we're doing this, it's worth noting that we have a 16-bit ISA slot here. The 286 allows for that 16-bit slot. So that's really convenient. But there's no riser. There's nothing to do here. Like the metal bracketing on the back of this is still designed for when you had multiple Apricot style expansion boards plugged into the back. Even the plastics on the lid of the case here still has the little tiny knockouts here. I can just kind of bend one of these tabs and pop this out for the narrow, tiny expansion cards that are supposed to go in here. Actually, it's weird. If you look at the bottom, the underside of the lid, there's actually a compartment here. This all pops off, and there's like a whole, like, it looks like a riser that sits exactly in this cutout here and allows something to go higher up in the case. But I don't know what the hell it is. That must have been some sort of thing that they had planned for the computer and then later abandoned it. So I'll take the 4 screws that come out of here. So 1, 2, and I have 1 screw here which has eaten out its plastic. 3, 4, and while I take this 4th screw out here, you may notice, what is this writing that you have right here? HCYSEC. So with these 2 cable MFM drives, when the battery goes flat, there is no auto configuration of the hard drive in the BIOS. So instead you have to manually set in the disk parameters. This drive has 4 heads, 615 cylinders, and 17 sectors. And if I pop this lid off here, you can see I've written more onto here. So that translates to a Type 2 AT hard drive, 24.4 megabytes. And here's a list of defective cylinders that were immediately obvious on the drive. So when I do the low-level format, I enter those in to mark that those parts of the disk are already dead. We can now see in here the 5 1/4 inch floppy drive, and then there's this black plastic tube which is living over here. This actually has 2 batteries. This is the CMOS battery living over here. It's 2 AA cells. You cannot access these cells without removing the power supply. You cannot remove the hard drive or the floppy drive without removing this whole disk assembly here. There we go. But even then, you can't really lift it out because it's all screwed together in weird places. This is really, really, really dumb. Yeah, there we go. I think it's just, there we go. I have 2 more screws hiding here. And you can see here again, I have it marked set to 120 volts. I didn't finish off my story, did I? So this here, much like with the other systems, use an Aztec power supply, and there is a jumper inside of it that converts it from 230 volts to 120 volts, depending on where you are in the world. This coming out of the UK was already configured for 230 volts, so I just simply opened up the power supply, and I did a recap. I did a video on that actually a while ago, and then while I was in there, I set the jumper, so it's now set to 120 volts. Why is everything so explicitly marked that it needs to be 120 volts? Because the monitor that's just hiding out a shot right here is still wired for 220 volts. I'm going to explain that one in a bit. So I'll grab, how many screws are in here? Yeah, you see? Like there's screws in weird hidden and out of the way places. That one there almost fell, that one fell into the case, so I have to open it anyways. So I'll grab this and I pull it out, and immediately underneath I have cables going everywhere in here. So there's our power cable for that. So, okay, sure, fine. And I will take you, which is your speaker, which, by the way, it's like there's a sticker here for where the speaker's supposed to go. And this is where the sticker or the speaker currently is, not because it's slipped. It physically will not fit on that sticky pad with the floppy drive in there. And the floppy drive has its own custom molded front case on it, and it's like slid in there and it's in place. So they had to kludge this out of the way after it was manufactured, which is kind of dumb, but okay. But now I have access to the 2 batteries that are hiding inside of here. So here's the AA cells right here. I'm going to unplug that. To get into that, I have to use a flathead to twist the cap here, and then that comes out. And over here, you used to have one of these 3.6 volt rechargeable batteries sitting right here. And this is actually kind of nice because it sits in a far out of the way corner where if the battery does leak, it doesn't cause any, well, it doesn't cause as much catastrophic damage. Like all the chipsets and ICs are hiding up over in this area here. Over here is just mostly capacitors and RAM. And I have this cable right here which says, on one side of it says microphone out. On this side over here, it says audio in. It is by no coincidence that right next to that, we have the keyboard input. Like I said, the microphone had to come from somewhere. Here's our 15-port connector here for the power supply, which used to be external, but now is sitting on top, and it uses a 15-pin plug that's sitting right there. And I have a power cable which has snaked through the case in such a weird way. You really have to separate the drives and the power supply and set them off to the side as their own thing, because otherwise you have to remove the drive to get the power cable out. So I'm just going to go like that. I think I have all the screws out. I do, which then lets me leverage the system backwards and forwards. There's another connector right here. We'll unplug that. There's our 2 headers for the MFM drive. This thing here, for some reason, has provisions allowing it for 2 hard drives, but I don't see how you'd ever fit one in there unless you're using the server version of this in the Xenix configuration. And then that all goes out of the way. And that almost reveals everything on the motherboard at this point. And I can see the screw that I had dropped before, so I'm just going to put that out of the way there. So overall, at this point here, it's just a PC. So everything that you expect in an IBM 5170 is going to be here. So here's our 8286. It's an 8 megahertz clocked chip. Here's the socket here with jumpers on it, specifically for the 8287. Here's the chipsets and support chips for it. We have BIOS version 1.13 from Phoenix sitting over here. And then we have our floppy controller, our hard disk controller, our video display ROM. So this is interesting here. I'm just noticing it. So here's the Hitachi HD 46505 that I was talking about all the way back with the Victor 9000. The same video chip is still inside of this machine, which is weird because I just said before, this thing has Hercules graphics support. We're going to double check that when we power the system up. I can see there is a PGA chip that's soldered down here with Apricot branding, but I'm pretty sure that's a Hitachi part number there. In fact, a lot of these here seem to be either NEC, Western Digital. There's Mitsubishi there, but Hitachi stuff right around here. And then we got a bodge board that's soldered in. Yes, that's soldered in, which just says Gate Array Modification Board. The batteries, let me just untangle that. So the battery here, I kind of kludged this in and relocated it to the far corner over here. So if it does leak, it's even more out of the way. Here's our RAM hiding right here. So this is 2 banks of 256 kilobytes. So this is our local 512 kilobytes of storage. Expansion memory goes into this header right here, and there's 4 screw holes here for plastic standoffs, so it sits off and you stack the RAM on top of it. Presumably before the power supply was here, you had considerably more space to do that. You can't do that anymore. So this is kind of another weird janky thing. If you buy this machine and just use the 512 kilobytes of RAM that are in the system, you have 0 wait states, whatever. As you add RAM into the system, you add wait states. So that technically means the more RAM you add, the worse the system performs, which is not great, unless I'm not understanding wait states here. I could totally be wrong. Otherwise, there we go. I don't think there's really too much else otherwise to say. You can see here's our 2 expansion connectors hiding here. So this large blue one, I bet you money, is just power and the 16-bit ISA slot right here. And here's our other one here, which I'm, again, pretty sure this is just a breakout for the floppy controller over here. And I do have some programmable chips. I have another custom Hitachi chip that's hanging out right here. And I have memory here, which is presumably video memory for the high-resolution display and Hercules graphics, or I could be wrong about that. There's really nothing else to show in this thing. So I guess on that note there, I'm just going to put the system back together. We all know what that means. Oh, I'm sorry. I must have bumped this at some point here. I don't know how long ago that was. So I have the system now completely assembled and all that jazz. Now you noticed when I did that, I only unplugged one battery, and that's simply because the CMOS settings had to be retained. Unlike with all of the other Apricot systems up until this point, because we have a new BIOS, which doesn't auto-magically configure itself for a hard disk controller, when the CMOS settings are lost, you need to install or insert a floppy, which lets you boot up into the setup environment in the system. Oh yeah, and before I forget, remember how I was saying this whole system's been rewired for 115 volts with the exception of the monitor? The monitor is still wired for 220, 230 volts like it was because there is no adjustment jumper inside of it to change it to North American voltages. Instead, what I'm doing here is kind of janky. Well, okay, there's jankier ways to do it, but even at the recommendation of Adrian Black at Adrian's Digital Basement, I'm not about to go and mess with the rectified DC side of this monitor to make it work properly. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the 220 volts that's available in my workshop just to power this monitor. My workshop is wired for 220 volts via this high current step-up transformer. All I have to do is turn it on, and over on my workbench, I have a Schuko plug which supplies that power. So I can simply plug in the cable and then run an extension cord back out to the other room. There we go. So now I have power to the monitor. So let's continue where I was. So I'll put that disk in. I'm going to turn the system on now. There we go. And that is going to now boot up from the floppy drive. There we go. And this is the same boot floppy that we used during the video I did a fair number of years ago now, where I actually applied the recovery media to this system. So I'm going to say no here, because we aren't going to do that this time around. I'm just going to do SETUP, and this would get us into the setup utility for the BIOS. Now this is all Phoenix. This is all fairly standard stuff at this point here. So I can specify what diskette drives are installed in the machine, and right now it's set to type 2, 5 1/4 inch, 80 track. It's a high density, but we can put 3.5 inch, 1.44 megabyte if I wish. It would have to be in one of the external side caddies in order to do that, because we don't have space inside of the machine because the drive is pretty much permanently in place. For the hard drive, we have again type 2. It's a 20 megabyte drive. Tape drive, which is also available if we have the models that are the server, and then in that case there, you can use a tape drive with here. It's just floppy tape. I've done a video on floppy tapes as well. It's kind of the same thing without a tape accelerator plugged into it. And then we have our system memory and our expansion memory. Now, this can be fun because sometimes the CMOS will go flat on this and you can get a weird garbage value in there. I actually had one particular instance where every time you went into the setup, it would crash because it was showing a negative number for the RAM that was installed. I had to pull the battery, wait for it to clear again, and then try it again, and then it worked totally fine. Other than that, we set our primary video adapter, and so here we see I'm in mode 3, so it's in monochrome Hercules compatibility, but we can also support CGA in 40 and 80 column, as well as EGA from this system, which is really, really cool. You can get color monitors, you can get fairly decent colors on this. It's still a 286 with 512K. Anyways, we'd be happy with all that, and we would exit out, but I'm just going to pop the floppy disk out. We're going to hold the reset button. And so this is a Phoenix Technologies BIOS. There we go. And we're going to boot from the hard drive here. So we have the mouse driver, we have a text driver, we have our micro screen, and we have everything loading up in here. And now also it says the Apricot 720 by 348 monochrome Hercules graphics extension has also been installed. And at this point here, it's MS-DOS. Thankfully, we do get back the micro screen. So remember how we had the calculator on the PCXi? I can go back into that one there. And it operates like a calculator. I can send it to the screen, whatever that is, and I can turn it off. This micro screen is currently configured with a default set of functions. So if I want to do a directory from there, I can do that. That's no problem. If I want to go into GW Basic, that's as simple as pushing one button. Now, watch what happens when I hit GW Basic. Goes in, and it relabels itself. So now I have dim, data, go, sub, return, line print, and beep available from there as quick keys. And if I exit out, it takes me right back to the DOS overlay for it. We also have three other things that are on the micro screen, and that is, the first one is we do have Gem installed on this. This does not have overlays for the micro screen, but this is the Gem environment. It is currently running in Hercules mode. This is Gem version, there we go, version 1.2, September 9th, 1985. So this is fairly late in the game. For this one here, I have one Gem application that's on 5 1/4 inch, and I can actually run it on here, but I'm not going to be using this as a MIDI sequencer, and I don't believe there's any other, oh, cancel, that's because it's the that's the A drive. I don't believe I have any apps. Oh, I do have apps installed right now. Let's go into there. Nope, I have no Gem apps right now, so unfortunately there's not a whole hell of a lot I can show you in terms of applications for this. Well, let's clear out of that. I'll hit quit on that. So the other operating system selection that was available to you other than Gem is that Apricot still couldn't be let go of all their old tricks. They still had to try and be innovative and spend money on something, even when they were beginning to circle the drain themselves. And so as a result, they approached Microsoft, who had given them their OEM to DOS many years before, and Apricot is one of the few companies that has a licensed copy of Windows 1.03. It is not the Microsoft version. If I hit the Win button, it specifically goes up as Apricot instead of Microsoft. And then here we go. We come up into the system for running Microsoft Windows. Let's see if I can go to Win Apps, load some pictures here, and we can go to the MS Paint Tiger if we want. We'll let that load up. No, that's a burger. Okay, yeah. No, that's the burger. See? That's a burger. Yep. So this is also running in Hercules graphics mode as well. And I can actually close out of that from here if I want to, and I can use the close button again to exit out of Microsoft Windows. But we still have the Zentel that's sitting over here. And you may have noticed that when this started up into Windows, we did get another overlay with Zentel on there, but the Zentel's light, or the light for the Zentel here, has gone out. And that means the Zentel feature is not installed in this computer. The software is not present, so they just turned it off. And if I hit that button, nothing happens because it's been simply turned off. It would be really cool to get the Zentel option for this, just to have the telephone. I know Mike of the Core Store has one. He may have had multiple at one time, but I've never seen another one come up for sale. So unfortunately, I can't show you that. But otherwise, that's just a telephone that I can tell. So we're going to close out of that. We'll end my Windows session. We'll do that. It'll go back to the DOS overlay. So is this 100% IBM PC compatible now? Yes, it is. The easiest way to show that, so we're going to go to, I think that's the one. Nope. There we go. And WRAKS. This is Microsoft Works. Again, it's running in Hercules mode. So I am able to get a cursor. I'm able to get tiled windows in a DOS environment. Pretty, isn't it? So I'm going to X out of there, but that is not the guaranteed test if you are 100% PC compatible. There are two applications that almost guarantee it. One is Lotus 123, which I don't have on here because they're copy protected disks. But the other one is Flight Simulator. So they're going to hit that. And we don't need our questions. Let's go straight into this. Starts up Flight Simulator. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Microsoft Flight Simulator is running. I do also have cursor control while I'm in Flight Simulator. So the mouse driver is available not only to Windows and GEM, but to any DOS applications like we saw in Microsoft Works. So I could run the demo here if I want to, but Microsoft Flight Simulator's Microsoft Flight Simulator. DOS is DOS, and, well, I think at this point here I've given the point across that Apricot has gone from its heyday of being an MS-DOS compatible system to being a PC compatible system, and there are really no other sacrifices besides legacy software support that have been sacrificed on this. Not too bad, but that's the Zen for you. From this point here onwards, things begin to really fall off the rails for Apricot. The Zen would go through several reconfigurations. You would lose the micro screen display. You would lose the trackball mouse in favor of a regular mouse. We would go away from the 5.25-inch floppy drive and back to the 1.44 megabyte 3.5-inch floppy disk drive. And of course you would get improved color displays. Internally, you would also get a 386 version of the Apricot Zen as well, all of which were IBM PC compatible. Apricot would also begin manufacturing low-cost generic clones that really were just AT form factor tower cases with the Apricot logo slapped on. It was pretty sad. But they still released at least 2 more machines under the Apricot name that were truly like inspired and had that feel of like we really wanted to put our best into this machine. The first one was the Apricot Qi. So it was a desktop workstation type device, and unfortunately all the peripherals were all the same, but it's one of the few systems, Apricot was one of the few vendors in fact, to license the microchannel architecture from IBM. That is a true microchannel machine inside of it. What's the other big quirk about it? Well, security. One thing you could do with that machine is that you received an infrared keycard, and you could use that to remotely lock and unlock the machine. The other system that Apricot released, and it was more than likely their last in-house design system, was the Apricot VX FT. Historically speaking, this is the first machine that anyone can find that used Intel's then brand new 486 microprocessor. It was a floor-standing double-wide tower. It looks a lot like an Apple network server, but it has a built-in UPS, it has redundant power supplies, of course it's the microchannel architecture, and it was a true network file server. It wasn't some clunky PC with a bunch of fancy boards on it saying, well, we have all this SCSI, we're now a server. And that was really it. The only other purchase that Apricot would go into was buying Sequent Systems in 1987. This would give them machines that they would also rebrand under the name. This would also be the time in which I would start to see Apricot doing desperate things, rebranding other people's products. There is one photograph and advertisement for the Apricot Zen where I can clearly see they're talking about desktop publishing, and there's an Apple laser writer with the Apricot logo slapped over the Apple logo. That's pretty cheap. That's pretty jank. But what have I been talking about so far about these weird European design quirks or UK design quirks that have been going on? It's weird, but that's the way it worked. And then, in 1990, Apricot decided to sell the hardware division entirely to Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi would continue on selling Apricots as network workstations and office computers, eventually making a couple of multimedia systems that all the way up to the Pentium era. In 1999, however, they would finally divest themselves completely of computers, shutting down Apricot's production lines and ending the Apricot computer line as we know it. Now, the software side, on the other hand, took this opportunity to rename themselves back to Applied Computer Techniques. From what information I can find, they went back to just doing services as a software bureau executive, being consultants and developing applications for custom users. One such example was the then new London ambulance dispatch system. It's debatable whether or not their code was responsible for it, but when that system launched in, 1993, it was a disaster. It was an absolute chaotic day. But it sounds like after that, they just rode themselves off into the sunset, and I haven't heard from them since. As for the Apricot name, what happened to it? Well, it was basically a dead name for quite a number of years. And then it seems in the mid-2010s, a brand holding group, which also holds the naming rights to Acorn computers, purchased Apricot's naming as well. There's a new website up, which just kind of runs through the history of all the Apricot computers that the internet knows about, and has a couple of fancy photos of some of the various computers there. That's Apricot computers for you, and I've now run through the entire range from when they first started with the idea of building their own computer following the success of the Sirius 1 and the Victor 9000, all the way through to the first IBM PC compatible system they sold, the Apricot Zen-I. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sure at some point in the last couple of videos here I've made the odd error and mistake, and you're more than willing to correct me in the comments whenever you wish. But there's so few people talking about these computers, much less poking around in the hardware. I'm really hoping what I could get across to you was that this is neat stuff. It's not an Apple knockoff product. It's not some parody product. It was a real competing product in the United Kingdom, and it saw sales in various places internationally. And I like these systems a lot, and that's why I've spent the last couple of years collecting them, starting all the way back from the days when I first saw the Zen and I was like, I want that computer. And that was 30 years ago now. Anyways, I do hope you enjoyed this video series, and until next time, have a good one.